Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning we come together and celebrate several things, actually. One of which is Veterans Day. And John Murdoch has picked out some wonderful songs or hymns that I urge you to sing with gusto that honor our country and those who have served our country. And thank you, John, for doing that. We'll also say prayers for those who are actively involved in military service and for all those of you who have been veterans of our armed forces as well. But we also come together to hear our news about stewardship, some of which is very good. The spirit of St. Vitus is very good in terms of openness to giving of time and talent. We may have a little ways to go right now in terms of our openness to giving of treasure. But let's not forget the underlying fact that this is a very holistic and healthy place. And the words of Jesus today are reminders of something about our commitment to others, and both others that are within our own family systems, and I'm talking about our own nuclear family systems, as well as those of us to whom we are related as human beings in the United States of America. And you're probably wondering, what in the world am I talking about? Because the gospel passage seems to be talking only about stewardship, about giving of monies. And of course, it's been used in that way by me and probably by every preacher in America over the years at this time of year in order to kind of differentiate the giving and the spirit of giving between those who had large sums of money and this poor widow who only had a penny. And of course, Jesus calls attention to the giving of the poor widow and says that she has given more than all of the others combined to the treasury of the temple. It's interesting that Jesus says these words in the temple and is surely the object, therefore, of much anger by the wealthy. I want to talk to you in a way that my eyes have been opened about another aspect, though, of looking at this passage, which I think we need to pay attention to. Because Jesus himself, in this passage, puts in motion a value that I hope is bred in our bones, both as Christians and as citizens of the United States of America. A value that is bred in our bones and that we all too frequently either take for granted or take flippantly. What if this passage were to be interpreted in the following way? Jesus is taking out those who are wealthy because they are devouring widows' homes. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jewish history. It may come as a shock to you that prior to this, widows had no right of inheritance. This is a very specific thing in Jewish law, and in fact practiced not only by Jews, but by people outside of Jewish law as well. At the time of Jesus, if you were married to a man who was providing some sense of income, some source of livelihood, and that man died, you had no right of inheritance to any of that estate. Do you follow what I'm saying? Now, it's hard for us to imagine that today. It's hard for us because of Jesus himself. But at that time, the Jewish people practiced a rather kind of rigid adherence to a law that denied widows and their children, orphans, any kind of access to making a living. It seems hard to imagine, doesn't it? But given the circumstances of the time, women not only could not inherit anything from the family estate, but they couldn't go out and make a livelihood either. It was a double whammy. You follow what I'm saying? They were absolutely placed in a position of poverty. And it was only because of the beneficence and generosity of others that they could even eke out a living that allowed them not to starve. This is beyond subsistence living. It is living in the depths of poverty. Those of you that are widows today, I know I've got your attention. So in Naomi and Ruth's time, the first readings from the book of Ruth, what we find is a magnificent story of a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. Naomi was the mother-in-law whose husband had died, and her own son had died, who was married to a woman named Ruth. And Naomi was without any kind of means in her native country, and she fled to Israel, where she thought perhaps she could at least live off of the generosity of some of the Jewish believers. And the amazing thing about that Bible story, for those of you that remember it, is Ruth followed her. Ruth would not be left back apart from Naomi, in part because she was loyal to her mother-in-law. She didn't have to be, but she was. And in part because her own husband had died. And it's a great kind of love story between two women, Naomi and Ruth. So much so that in today's first reading, what we find is Naomi doing the only thing that a woman could do, especially an elderly woman who was widowed. And that was she tried desperately to find a husband for her daughter-in-law, Ruth. You follow me so far? And lo and behold, here comes this man of means named Boaz. Boaz himself was a widower. And it sounds very kind of paternalistic by our standards today. But if Ruth was to have any kind of life whatsoever, she had to get attached to a man. And Naomi sets it all up so that her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who was widowed, could now be attached to this eligible widower named Boaz. And lo and behold, it works out beautifully. But you can see the anxiety, you can see the plight of women particularly back in those days. And the incredible thing about this passage that we forget about or we don't see is that it's Jesus himself who calls that whole system into question by talking about the rich who devour widows' houses. They devour that for their own personal wealth. And Jesus clearly calls that into question. I think even though this passage does touch on stewardship, at its heart, it's a matter of social justice. It's a matter of saying we can do better than this, even within the confines of Jewish faith. We can do better and we must do better. Because it's just not right for the wealthy, who already have more than they need to live on, to devour widows' houses. Now we take that for granted today. years, in fact, over the centuries, we've been hammering out an ethic, a deeply rooted value that says, first of all, that if you are widowed, you have at least a claim to the estate. Some of you who are lawyers like Mark Cullen, I'm sure, draw up wills every day, specifying the terms of the estate. And husbands, if you're careful and loving, you better include your spouse in terms of that estate. It's a Christian ethic that has spread throughout our culture now. I dare say it would be very cruel for anyone to exempt his wife from the estate. And not only have we done this individually as a Christian ethic, are you beginning to see the importance of this passage? Not only have we done that from a Christian perspective, but we've done it from a societal perspective as well. The Social Security Act of 1935 was a Johnny-come-lately on the scene compared with the awareness in Europe, in Western Europe particularly, of the need for providing for people a sense of support in their old age. When Otto von Bismarck unified Germany in the 19th century, he began that process that we call now Social Security for people of a certain age, so that they wouldn't have to live in poverty and desperate straits in their old age. We take it for granted now. But it wasn't always that way. And in 1935, in the depths of the Great Depression, the FDR administration came up with the idea of similar protection for Americans. I did some research on the Social Security Act of 1935 and found that in the room, FDR had asked 10 men to come up with a decision about the age of Social Security, when it would go into effect. And half of the men in the room, namely 5 of these men, all white, said 60. 60 should be the age because we want people to enjoy a modicum of life after they've finished their working years. And others, 5, said no, 70 should be the age because we don't want to overextend what is put into the fund with what we pay out. And if you make 70 the age, then you won't have to pay out as much. And they couldn't agree, and finally they just said, well, FDR has told us to come up with a decision, let's just split the difference. You think I'm kidding? That's how the age of 65 got into our initial, at least, Social Security Act. But the intent was definitely in the right direction. The intent held up something that is very, very precious for us as Christians, that Jesus himself is responsible for starting. And that is a respect for people regardless of their age or status in life after a certain point in life. We don't want to live in a culture, and we don't certainly want to be part of a religious grouping that discards the poor or the orphans or the widows. It's just not right. It denies something that runs very deep within a human spirit. And so it's appropriate, I think, for Christians to be able to talk about social justice, to be able to talk about social policy. It's part of our heritage. It's part of our heritage because our founder, Jesus, talked about social justice. It should be bred in our bone. Christianity is much more than a Sunday-only religion. It's why when we have the need to bring in food for the food pantry, we do so. And I want to say something about my history in the Episcopal Church. It should be always clear as Episcopalians that there is a correlation between our faith and the country in which we live. The Church of England, for example, has always maintained a correlation between church and state. And we Episcopalians have always seen service to country in connection with our faith. Whether it be in the military, where there are traditionally have been a large number of people that we would call military brass who are Episcopalians, or whether it be in service to country in the foreign, in the Secretary of State's office, for example. We've always been that way as Episcopalians. We see ourselves not only as a Sunday-only denomination, but we see ourselves as interacting with the culture and with the nation in which we live. So, if you think that this passage from Mark is just a kind of innocuous passage, think again, because it has implications for each and every one of us in this very day and age. We're connected to one another, and we can't let somebody become less than human simply because they're orphaned or widowed or poor. The dream and the vision of Jesus was grander than that. The dream and the vision of Jesus was to say to the scribes and Pharisees who were present that day in the temple and who might be present in various places today, don't, whatever you do, take the mortgages away from poor widows. Don't, whatever you do, not provide enough for people to eat, to be fed, to be clothed. That's who we are, not only as followers of Jesus, but as human beings. We're providers so that all may have enough. Amen. Now let us stand and sing aloud together the nice hymn.